Hi, this is Corey Franklin with Remembering the Past, the show where we talk about people who've died recently who've had a profound effect on our history, our society, or our culture. Tonight we're going to do a special show because a Congressional Medal of Honor winner died recently, and we want to make note of the fact every time one of our heroes dies. There are now only 79 Congressional Medal of Honor winners left after the recent death of Vernon McGarity, who died at the age of 91. Technical Sergeant McGarity was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor by President Truman in 1945 for his heroic efforts at the Battle of the Bulge in December of 1944. The Battle of the Bulge was the last great German counteroffensive of World War II on the Western Front. In June of 1944, American, British, and Canadian troops, the Allied troops in the West, invaded Europe in the French peninsula of Normandy. Despite heavy resistance, they managed to break through and organize their troops for the ultimate invasion of Germany. For the next 2 months, they faced heavy resistance as they fought through the French countryside, as the Germans lost 500,000 men. The Germans at this point were fighting on two fronts, with the massive Russian army bearing down on them from the east. In August of 1944, the Allied troops had a chance to trap 250,000 Germans in the Falaise Gap. Had they done so, there would essentially be no Germans to fight on the Western Front. But they let most of the Germans escape, and the Germans fought fiercely as they continued to fall back towards German borders through October, November, and the beginning of December of 1944. With American troops at the German border near the end of December of 1944, they had to hold up. They'd essentially outrun their supply lines, and the British were tired after the failure of their Operation Market Garden, where they had tried to drop paratroopers behind the German lines in an unsuccessful attempt to surround German forces. So essentially there was a stalemate at that point while the Americans retooled for the ultimate invasion into Germany. At this point, Hitler launched an audacious gamble. Rather than remain on the defensive and defend the German borders, Hitler decided to counterattack. He mobilized 250,000 troops, all that he had left that he couldn't spare for the Eastern Front, and in point of fact, he did take troops from the Eastern Front where they were badly needed, mostly young, inexperienced soldiers. And in a secret maneuver, they would go through the Ardennes forest and attack the Americans on two fronts, attempt to encircle them, capture their supplies. They would meet up at Antwerp, and with the American army encircled, he assumed that the Americans would sue for peace, and he could then strike a better deal and concentrate his forces on the Russians. The secret plan to go through the Ardennes forest was the same plan that the Germans had used in 1940 to attack France and had used at the beginning of World War I. The plan depended on bad weather. It depended on the fog of December to neutralize American air superiority, and the Germans called it Operation Autumn Fog. Hitler's generals didn't like the plan because they didn't feel that he had enough men to encircle the Americans. But at that point in the war, no one was about to argue with Hitler. The surprise of the plan actually caught the Americans by surprise, and the Americans suffered their worst defeat of the Western Front, with thousands killed or captured. The American troops were generally their most inexperienced troops, and they weren't prepared for seasoned German veterans who attacked them on two fronts. For several days, the outcome was in doubt. It looked like the Americans might be encircled and might have to surrender on a massive scale. The German attack had created a huge bulge in the American forces, hence the name of the battle. But Hitler's generals ultimately proved right. He didn't have the manpower to encircle the Americans completely, and the Germans were never able to meet up at Antwerp. Eventually, the fog lifted, and American air superiority knocked them out of the war, and essentially left Germany defenseless for the invasion of 1945. Hitler's gamble with a counteroffensive to take the Americans out of the war resulted in him not having any troops to defend the western fronts of Germany for 1945. But before it did, Americans suffered serious losses at the Battle of the Bulge. Here's a 1945 newsreel on the Battle of the Bulge, the worst American setback on the Western Front in World War II.
On December 16th, the triumphant cheers died down in Europe. In the Christmas season of 1944, nobody was predicting that the war would end by Saturday night, or a week from Wednesday. And today, with the good news from all fronts singing on all radios, let us remember the dying days of 1944. The infantry remembers those days. The army had come fast and far last fall. We had developed a certain tendency to become complacent. Complacency came to an end in time for the Christmas season. In December, we learned all over again the bitter lesson of war. War is conducted in mist and turmoil and Uncertainty. Victory comes on no silver platters. The enemy sells nothing cheaply. The enemy is resourceful, desperate. The Nazi party is willing to sacrifice every building and every soul in Germany to stave off defeat. Reserves of men and materiel have been hoarded for the day of counterattack. Under cloudy skies and close-hanging ground mists that defied aerial observation, the very much alive German army gathered its forces in the forest aisles to strike one strong, decisive blow at the American army. New and refitted divisions were brought up under cover of fog, darkness, and forest. The fury of robot and rocket weapons was unleashed against our front. In one day, the enemy smashed through the defenses of the American First Army on a 45-mile front and was biting deep into Luxembourg and Belgium. In 24 hours, the initiative changed hands, and the German army, which had put the word blitzkrieg into all languages, unleashed its desperate offensive. They had picked a time when the weather prevented us from using the air weapon, the weapon in which we decisively outweigh them. In August, it was German convoys that were caught like this along the French roads. Now it was our convoys, ruined, burning where they'd been overrun. The sweat and iron of Detroit and Pittsburgh became the wreckage of Malmedy and Saint-Vite. We lost more than jeeps and half-tracks, tires and shells, tanks and guns. We lost men, 78,000 in dead, wounded, and missing, unarmed and defenseless American prisoners. Comrades of these men fell to the machine guns of our enemies. 4 weeks later, their frozen bodies, hands and ankles bound, were found where they fell. These Belgian enemies of the Third Reich, too, were unarmed and defenseless. Men who had not retreated since their arrival in Europe plodded back along the mean roads of winter Belgium. Convoys of trucks streamed to the rear with supplies that had been painstakingly accumulated at forward dumps. To stop counterattacks, huge new reserves of supplies are called for. Gallant American units, surrounded and cut off, fought in a sea of enemy armor. Anti-aircraft guns were fired point blank as anti-tank guns until they were overrun. Cooks, bakers, quartermaster, and line of communications troops picked up their rifles and fought tenaciously against Nazi columns. The weather cleared and the Air Force took to the skies to bomb and strafe and fight the rejuvenated Luftwaffe to the ground. The army held in Belgium. The attack was blunted, the spearhead stopped, the Nazi columns contained and thrown back by men who had flung themselves into the breach. In the wild gamble of war, a momentary equilibrium had been gained. The cost had been great, and there were no guarantees being issued on engraved paper on the Western Front that the time of counterattacks was over. Nor, despite the great victories in the Pacific, were there guarantees being issued that there would be no counterattacks against the many islands we'd won back. In the general uncertainty of war, one fact remains certain. The enemy is always dangerous. The enemy does not slack off.
Well, there are a number of familiar stories that come out of there. The reference to American troops being machine gunned was a reference to Malmedy, which was a town in Belgium where American prisoners were bound and tied and machine gunned in a prisoner of war massacre. Another story is the story of Bastogne, which was a town that was nearly surrounded during the Battle of the Bulge, and the commanding officer, General Anthony McAuliffe, was asked by the Germans to surrender, and he made the famous reply, "Nuts." Even today in Bastogne, there's a Nuts Cafe. He's actually reported to have said something stronger, but that's what all the stories say. There's also the story of Otto Skorzeny, the master SS super spy, who trained a school for spies and had 2,000 Germans learn to behave and speak like Americans, and they were sent behind the American lines during the Battle of the Bulge. That's where you see in all these movies where they ask who won the World Series last year and who plays for the Brooklyn Dodgers. It was a means of identifying Skorzeny super spies from true Americans. Technical Sergeant McGarity's story began on the first day of the Battle of the Bulge on December 16, 1944. This is his story as described by the Congressional Medal of Honor website when his company was overrun as the Battle of the Bulge opened. Technical Sergeant McGarity was painfully wounded in an artillery barrage that preceded the powerful counteroffensive launched by the Germans near Krinkelp, Belgium on the morning of 16 December 1944. He made his way to an aid station, received treatment, and then refused to be evacuated, choosing to return to his hard-pressed men instead. The fury of the enemy's Great Western Front offensive swirled about the position held by Technical Sergeant McGarity's small force, but so tenaciously did these men fight on orders to stand firm at all costs that they could not be dislodged despite murderous enemy fire and the breakdown of their communications. During the day, the heroic squad leader rescued one of his friends who had been wounded in a forward position, and throughout the night he exhorted his comrades to repulse the enemy's attempts at infiltration. When morning came and the Germans attacked with tanks and infantry, he braved heavy fire to run to an advantageous position where he immobilized the enemy's lead tank with a round from a rocket launcher. Fire from his squad drove the attacking infantrymen back, and 3 supporting tanks withdrew. He rescued, under heavy fire, another wounded American, and then directed devastating fire on a light cannon which had been brought up by the hostile troops to clear resistance from the area. When ammunition began to run low, Technical Sergeant McGarity, remembering an old ammunition hole about 100 yards distant in the general direction of the enemy, braved a concentration of hostile fire to replenish his unit's supply. By circuitous route, the enemy managed to emplace a machine gun to the rear and flank of the squad's position, cutting off the only escape route. Unhesitatingly, the gallant soldier took it upon himself to destroy this menace single-handedly. He left cover, and while under steady fire from the enemy, killed or wounded all the hostile gunners with deadly accurate rifle fire and prevented all attempts to reman the gun. Only when this squad's last round had been fired was the enemy able to advance and capture the intrepid leader and his men. The extraordinary bravery and extreme devotion to duty of Technical Sergeant McGarity supported a remarkable delaying action, which provided the time necessary for assembling reserves and forming a line against which the German striking power was shattered. Well, that's what Technical Sergeant McGarity won his Congressional Medal of Honor for. Today, we take it for granted that the United States would be victorious in World War II. But for those few days in December of 1944, the outcome was not so certain. There was certainly the possibility that if the Germans had encircled our troops, we might have to surrender, and the world would look completely different than it does today. It was only through the efforts of Technical Sergeant McGarity and many others like him that Hitler and the Nazis were defeated. I'm going to close on that note. I want to thank my producer, Sid Tepps. Sergeant McGarity, we thank you for your service. We can never repay the debt we owe you as a nation. In closing, I want to play a song that was popular during World War II. It's a poignant song. It was written before the war in 1938, but it caught on as an anthem for our soldiers during the war, and the best version of the song was sung by Judy Collins. I'll be seeing you in all those familiar places. Technical Sergeant McGarity, thank you again for all you did for us.